Hello, welcome. It is about 7:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Looks like some folks are still kind of coming in, but I just want to jump in and welcome everyone tonight. I am Katie Dunn, Director of Educational Planning here at Prep Matters, and I am so delighted to welcome you to tonight's town hall meeting. We are excited to have a group of panelists with us tonight who are really on the ground knowing exactly what is happening in college admissions. There's a lot of rumors and a lot of buzz and a lot of stress out there, and we like to have these conversations to really get the real scoop from the actual humans who actually care about students, who are trying to make this process as easy and as successful for every student. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to please use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists. You will also see that you have the option of upvoting a question if someone asks something that you are also interested in hearing the answer to. I will try to keep a close eye on the Q&A box to guide the conversation. The college admissions process is daunting under the best of circumstances, and the last few years have hardly been that for most students. So I am grateful for your time tonight, and I hope that we can make some of this just feel a little less stressful. To get us started, I will introduce our panelists and ask them to kick us off by answering a first main question. Would you share one piece of advice for current juniors about how to launch this process? I will begin with Justin Brim, admissions counselor at Binghamton University, which is a part of the State University of New York system. Justin is himself a graduate of a SUNY college and a veteran leader in admissions with over a decade of experience. In addition to his current role as admissions counselor, Justin is also the liaison for the State University of New York's Educational Opportunity Program at Binghamton, which provides access, academic support, and financial aid to students who show promise for succeeding in college, but who may not otherwise have been offered admission. Welcome, Justin. What advice do you have for our juniors?
Thank you, Katie. It's glad to be on this panel. Hello, everyone. I would say the main thing is start on a kind of a macro level and think about why it is you want to go to college. I would just start really broad, really basic. Just kind of remind yourself. You may have been prepping yourself for this over the years, or maybe you're just completely fresh and new to this. So I think starting on that big of a level is really important. Just trying to think about, why do you want to go to college? Is it academic? Is it cultural, social, both? Is it financial? Just a mix of those things. The wow factor or the pressure or whatever the case may be. Start with that why, and then you start from there.
I think I didn't even ask myself why until I was 2 years into a PhD program. That is so smart. Our next guest, welcome, Justin. Our next guest is Tyler Gibbs. Tyler is a Senior Assistant Director for Academic Services at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Tyler grew up in Rutland, Massachusetts, and has now returned to Central Massachusetts after graduating from American University here in Washington, D.C., with a degree in communications, law, economics, and government. That is a complicated degree, Tyler. He knows a lot of stuff, and a minor in education studies. Quite involved in the admissions office all throughout his college career. At AU, he is now putting that experience to work at WPI. Welcome, Tyler. What advice do you have for our juniors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the why is a great place to start. And then I'd say, once you discovered the why, also looking on that macro level, with starting your search of figuring out, what type of school are you looking for? How far away from home? Do you want a large school, a small school? Do you want a school that's very specific, that only has very specific type of majors, or a school that offers a plethora of options so you can kind of bounce between things? And do you want to be in a city, in a more rural or suburban setting? That's a really great way, after you kind of figure out, why you want to go to college, to dive into those things. So that way, when you look online and you see thousands of colleges, it kind of narrows you in a bit more. So I'd say that would be a great first thing to do, especially as a junior.
Great. And I am personally delighted to welcome back our final guest, Nicholas Orban, Special Assistant to the Vice President for Enrollment Management at University of Maryland in College Park. Since starting at UMD in 2013, he has held multiple positions in the Office of Undergraduate Admissions. Most recently, Nick oversaw admission into the university's competitive major programs. A double alumnus from UMD, Nick holds a bachelor's in government and politics and a master's in teaching and learning policy and leadership, with a focus on education policy studies. I'm selfishly delighted to have Nick here because I've had the pleasure of hosting Nick on several previous webinars, including our first foray into webinars at the beginning of COVID. And also I frequently bombard him with questions from my students. So welcome, Nick. What advice do you have for our juniors?
Well, the first piece of advice is be nice to people, because then you get invited back to fun parties like hanging out with Katie. Well, no, seriously, good evening, everybody. And I first want to echo what Justin and Tyler said. Literally, those were two, when Katie first posed this question, Justin, oh, those are two answers that I would give. And like, crap, they both took them before I could give them. So the last piece of advice that I'll give, at least on this topic, is I think, is just to make sure that this process is enjoyable and is fun. I mean, I think for both valid and invalid reasons, the college admission process becomes so high stakes and becomes so stressful and worrisome. And I think we sometimes lose like the magic of it all in a way. Like we figure out when you as students and you as parents are going through this process together, I think there's really a lot of growth and learning that can come out of this process of figuring out things like a self-identity and self-advocacy. And also just, I think I'm an adventurer. I love, things like traveling or doing things that sort of have that adventure aspect. And if you really think about it, like you're thinking about where are you spending like the next 4 years of your life? Like this is, I think all of us would tell you college was a really fun 4 years or plus if you were, like me and Katie, who spent more time with grad degrees, and maybe Justin and Tyler too. I have no idea. The 4 years I think are really fun. And so I say all that to say, like, finding your home for these next 4 years is I think really a fun opportunity. And so I guess to round up my piece of advice, as stressful as it may seem, as panic inducing as it might be, remember to have fun with it. Remember to celebrate the positives.
I love the pyramid the three of you just drew there. We start with like, why am I even doing this? We go to like, okay, so then like, what do I need for me to flourish? And then we get to like, where am I living for the next 4 years? Where am I doing laundry? Who am I hanging out with? What will I be talking about? I love all of that. And I think it's really important. I'm gonna stick with a couple of the things you guys just mentioned for our first couple of questions, because I think it's really important, because so much of this feels to students. I see so many students starting in a place of like, well, where can I get in? And it just starts out in this place of feeling exclusive or feeling stressful or feeling like I don't know exactly where I belong. And I think Nick is spot on. The students who I see having the most successful process in every place I've ever worked are the ones that at the end realize like, oh, like I get myself in a way that I didn't get myself 2 years ago. And I'm really ready to step on this campus. I just had a student today whose mom said to him, remember, you need to register for that test. It's your account. You made it. I can't do it. And he said, I know, I did it last time. And I was like, oh, you're getting there. You're getting ready. But we all, of course, know that a lot of students are bringing into this process a great deal of stress. And newspaper articles that use words like bloodbath probably aren't helping. And so as we're seeing, as students are kind of looking in at the outside, seeing application increases, maybe application rate or acceptance rate decreases, and high numbers of students maybe being placed on the wait list and having a longer process. What do we do for these students to kind of get them to see that, helping them find a place to put those nerves and not feel like they are shut out before they've even begun? Who wants to jump in? Justin.
I can. So if you've been reading all the same things, Katie, that you had mentioned, parents, students, if you've been reading all that, that means you're doing your research, whether organically or very focused, you're already kind of trying to look and get a sense of what the experience is going to be like over this, upcoming year and stuff as you really start to transition out of secondary education and go into higher education. So one thing that I've been finding is with this really huge emphasis on college admissions and and the application process and such of the like. You have all these, as you mentioned, Katie, all these increase in applications in a lot of different places, very focused efforts on that. What I've been finding is also, in some ways, a lack of completed applications. There's such a mad rush of opportunities to put applications in different places, and there's positives there, that access, but there's also, I've been finding there's instances where students maybe not be so serious about so many of the schools that they're applying to. So the reason I say that is because you as students, as you're doing your research and you're finding the schools that you do want to apply to, it's very important that you also go through that process and complete it. Take a step back if it's seemed a little too stressful. As Nick was saying, may recognize the enjoyment of it, and there is enjoyment to be had in it. But I would stress that as you go through that process, because a lot of people are putting applications into places, they're getting through that start, but maybe not necessarily finishing things, or maybe losing interest along the way. I know COVID played a role in that, virtual spaces and stuff like that. I would say the importance of completing the application, staying on top of the communications and correspondence at the schools that you apply to are having. I think that's really important, because once you get kind of past those hurdles, then you'll see that the other opportunities can arise. You can correspond with people, you can touch base with admissions counselors, get to know them better. I'll stop there, but that's kind of what I've been finding. There's such an influx of this increase application, all these applications.
Sort of panic of I'm going to click all these buttons in Naviance. Not necessarily get myself to a full application. That's a great point. Any other thoughts to add on that? Like, how do we, I love the idea that even if what you're reading is something that is panicking you, you're researching. So sort of take that as a piece of this puzzle, and there's all these other ways to be doing it too. Let's think about that a little bit. Tyler mentioned, start asking yourself, do I want a city? Do I want a quiet? Do I want a big school? Do I want a small school? I've told these three gentlemen that I've set them up a little bit, that I have a system here of one school that's about 5,000, 4,500, one that is about 13 or 14,000, and one that is nearly 30,000. So we have a broad range here. So I want to touch on size, but let's also just touch on kind of how do I start asking those questions, and what questions should I be asking? So Tyler, since you led us in that direction, I'm going to jump to you. We often tell students, go research colleges in this abstract way. How do I start?
Yeah, so that's a great way to ask that question. I'd first think about your education setting currently in high school. Do you go to a large high school, a small high school? Do you feel like you're learning well in that environment? Do you feel like, it's too small, I wish there were more people I was able to meet? Or man, my high school is 40,000 people and I'm already like, this is a good size. I couldn't even imagine going to a school much larger than that. Thinking of it that way, but also in the context of where you live now, being in the DMV area, do you enjoy being close to a large metropolitan area? Or you're like, no, I want to be out like by the cows and I don't want to hear, the traffic next to my residence hall. Thinking about it in the context of where you are now, because like Nick was saying, you're going to live there for 4 years, theoretically, if you're living on campus. And it's a very unique time in your life where you have the opportunity to do that. When you get older, things get more complicated and it's harder to just pick up and relocate for a set period of time. So take advantage of that, but think about it all in the context of where you go to school now, where it's located and its size. And that will help, I think, steer you in the direction of what you should look at for a university.
Right. Nick said he was an adventurer, and I remembered that I went to college a half an hour from where I live now and where I was born. And maybe I could have been a little more of an adventurer when I was 17.
Yeah. And to kind of give like that example, I grew up in a very small town of about 7,000, 8,000 people, and I knew I wanted an urban environment. And so I was looking at that, schools in Boston and DC, and I ended up falling in love with AU because I had access to the city, but it still felt like a normal college campus. It was quieter, and I was able to escape a bit. And that's how I kind of got to that for myself.
So Tyler, tell us a little bit about how you think size plays out on campus at WPI.
Yeah, so WPI is about 5,000 students. I like to say we're right between a small and a medium-sized school. And in regards to our size, I like to say, it's the size where you're going to have students in a lot of your same classes, so you'll have that familiarity, but you're also going to meet new students throughout your entire time on campus with a size that big. But it's definitely smaller, so it's more, it creates that close-knit environment. And being a polytechnic school, all our students who are on campus are studying something STEM related. So when they get to campus, they already have like that, every student has that one thing in common already.
Right.
But it is definitely a smaller university for you to consider. And I know like UMD is much larger, but I know larger schools have great ways of creating communities within a larger community, which I think is an excellent way to help make something large feel not so large.
Yep. Nick, let's head to that. Tell us a little bit about sort of launching the search process and then about where you think size plays in at University of Maryland.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I just really loved Tyler's lead in on sort of like starting the search. And I think just one thing to kind of round it out is, I think about the values you have. Think about like what you and not just like you and your identity, but sort of, what are your values like in terms of close or far from home, or, that urban versus rural bit. I mean, I think there are lots of different things that make up an individual's identity. There are lots of different things that someone can value. To use my own example, I went to Maryland because my dad and 3 of his siblings and my brother all went to ACC colleges. Those of you who are Maryland fans may remember that Thanksgiving of 2011, Maryland announced that we left the ACC, and I was relegated to the kids' table at Thanksgiving as a 20-year-old. But like, and I use that just as like a quirky example. Like that was how Maryland ended up on my list, was like Maryland had a good business school and was in the ACC. And as Katie noted, I graduated with government and politics from a Big Ten school. So clearly things will change during your college career too. To transition over to the size conversation, I mean, I appreciate Tyler teeing up the ball for me really nicely there. And yet you're right, like there's a classic line you'll hear probably at every large public state school, which is you can make a big school feel small. And like as cheesy and quirky as that like statement is, I think that is actually something that Maryland and a lot of state schools and larger schools do really well. Yeah. To use Maryland as an example, so our freshman class is going to be about 4,500 students, and 70 to 75% of those incoming freshmen are invited to one of 6 different living and learning programs on campus. And so those are programs that are designed to give students that smaller community within the university. And we do that by housing students together in the same residence hall or series of residence halls, and then also giving students a shared academic curriculum. It's not going to be like all of your courses for a semester or for a year are going to be with this program of students, because you'll still have major, you still have general education classes, but instead maybe one course per semester for 1 to 2 to 4 years, depending on which program you're invited into, are going to be related to this living and learning program. And so it, like I said, creates this sense of community and bond, because you see students in the residence hall, you see them in the dining hall outside your residence hall, you see them in the classroom, and it just sort of makes it easier to develop those sort of friendships and connections. And I think kind of like to use WPI as an example, like Tyler said, everybody at WPI is going to be a STEM student. So you have this a shared identity from the start. Same thing happens with some of these living and learning programs. Like you already know, hey, I'm in College Park Scholars, you're in College Park Scholars. We already have at least one thing in common.
I also have the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, my sense of the physical layout of the campus at University of Maryland is that there has been a real effort to sort of create hubs where you are likely to, if you are a STEM student, if you are, that you sort of have a set of your classes probably in pretty close proximity to one another as well. So there's sort of a physical community built in too, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and of course, not every school is going to be designed perfectly. I don't think any school would ever tell you they're designed perfectly, but it was like for us, it's the longest walk a student would have for a school our size is 20 to 25 minutes. And that's if you live in one of the southernmost residence halls on South Campus, and you want to go to a basketball game, which is sort of like the northernmost building.
Right.
And then, but otherwise, like if you're talking about like the day to day, like going from residence hall to academic building, it's normally going to be 5 or 10 minutes. And so despite sort of the size of the university, it still is really accessible. And I think even to Katie's point that, a lot of your academic buildings, as you get more refined in what you're studying and sort of where your coursework is, courses sort of become concentrated in a few different areas. Like especially, if you're a psychology major, guess what? Most of your courses are probably going to be in the biology psychology building.
Right. And I want to actually highlight Nick's point about his business degree at an ACC school that turned into a government degree at a Big Ten school. I was absolutely going to be a lawyer. And then for a little while, an art historian, and now here I am. I'm very happy in my life, but the vast majority of adults are not doing what we thought we'd be doing when we were 18. I know some exceptions, so don't, at me, but most of us, 80% of college students change their majors. And so it's one of the reasons I think it's really important for a student to think about, what does it feel like to go to this college? Not just, do I want this major, but also what are the other pieces that I will experience while I'm there? Because there's a ton of majors you've never thought of.
Yeah.
Right.
So I was actually just looking this summer at like this spring, I should say, research on that same topic. Like a third of college students change their major within their first year. 10% of college graduates change their major twice or more. So while major in academics absolutely should be an important part of your college search, unless you're undecided, in which case, great, you've got a pretty wide offering. Remember that, a significant number of students end up studying something different than they planned. And that's okay. Like that's part of why colleges have different academic offerings is to offer a breadth and a diversity of academic study.
Right. It's really built into the system, the way we do college in the US. All right, Justin, we've done big and little. Tell us a little about our Goldilocks school in New York.
And I would say this to someone who lives 10 minutes, right within the Binghamton kind of greater Broome County area. You think generally, oh, I want to get out of here. I've been here 12 plus years. I want to leave as much as I can, or someone who's from 10 hours away. And I would say that the importance is just really kind of the feel. And how do you feel? So of course, for someone 10 minutes away, where you're looking, if it's very close, you might be able to stop onto the campus physically, of course. If you are looking at a place that's further away, and we say this to our students, because we have students that come from all across the world to Binghamton, we have great virtual opportunities where you can kind of get a sense first of like that general feel. Like, did I just kind of like, do I like the sound? Do I like what they're kind of offering? And that's when we've had over 50,000 visitors to Binghamton throughout the year. And I think that's partly due to the fact of you kind of start with this kind of overview of what are we about? What do we focus on? Academics, culture, best of both worlds, kind of, the university opportunities in research and development, but also feeling like you have opportunities to really get to know your professors well. The layout of our campus is very important too. Our main campus is pretty contained. And what I mean by that is even with 14,000 students, you don't really feel like you're bunched in, but you also don't feel like you're swarmed with people. And I think that for people who are looking for a mix of that, it really fits well. And I would say, but like I said, I'd speak also in the sense of just like for any colleges you're looking at, they do a lot of work on their web pages. The stuff that they put on their websites, they put it for a reason. So make sure that when you're researching, just check out the either a virtual visit or some type of photo stream gallery that just gives you a sense of like what the campus is like, what the buildings look like, what the residence halls look like. And I think that would help guide students toward, wanting to actually then make a campus visit if they have the opportunity to do so, which I think we do a really great job of just showing you the feel of our campus and what our culture is and what we're about as a mission of a university, which is about access and about really providing a public good, a public service to our greater community as a public university. And then from there, we just have a really great feel when you do step on campus. And I think that's what, we back up what we put on our website.
I hate to call it a silver lining because that is a pat, sort of flippant thing to say about a global pandemic, but the increase in and the sort of incredible quality of admissions offerings virtually for students, I think has been incredibly powerful for the college search process. But man, 50,000 visitors this year, that's a ton of tour guides. That's a ton of things you've been managing. So good for you. All right, let's talk some nuts and bolts of what you have seen. It is May, so everyone you've had a couple of weeks to kind of get some thoughts on this cycle. I think one of the things that feels very true to me since 2019 is that a ton of things change every year and a ton of things stay the same, because this is a process and we're building schools and building classes, and kids are kids. So big question that we get a lot, and I would love each of you to answer it. Now that you've done this for a couple of cycles, what are you seeing with how students are using test scores in their applications at your schools? Who wants to begin?
I can jump in really quick. Yeah, I can jump and just say that we've been standardized test optional for two cycles. This one and the one before, and we are going to be test optional for this upcoming cycle as well, the 2023 cycle. I've seen, and this is really cool, and maybe it's just because one of the advent of this like increase in virtual opportunities and this kind of and the access, but I've actually seen a lot of students really submit scores only if they had a really good feel that our historic kind of mid 50% of our SAT and or ACT was within that range, within the range that they had, or maybe they exceeded it, which is what we also recommend. So I'm thinking that a lot of other colleges and universities that students are looking at similar to Binghamton are recommending the same if they did have a kind of historical testing process before going test optional. So what we do recommend to students with us is, our historic range for an SAT or ACT has been within like a 1300 to 1450. So total, score. ACT would have been about a 29 to 32. What we're saying is, we're not saying to send the score. We're not giving like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like send your scores. What we're saying is that because this is historically where a mid 50% of our enrolling students are, and we bring about 3,000 students in every fall, first year students, we recommend that if you are within that range or higher, that is a comfort zone that you could probably feel comfortable sending your scores in. If you are not there, or whatever, you are there, you just don't feel, you're not sending your scores to anybody else, so why send them to Binghamton? That's all completely up to you. And we really do focus on, when it means test optional, we truly do mean that. And I think students have kind of bought into that. So what we've been seeing is students have been submitting their scores when they felt really, really comfortable about it. I think that has reflected in the admissions percentages and such. Those who didn't submit their test scores, we have a lot still to review in the application that they've submitted to make a viable admissions decision on them.
And do you have any sense of approximately what percentage of your students are submitting scores?
I believe it was,
It's okay, it's not a quiz.
Yeah, no, you know what's so funny? I actually know more of the general admissions rates for scores. Okay. Our university admissions acceptance rate, historically generally has been around low to mid 40%. Okay. That's low to mid 40s generally has been similar to those who have not submitted test scores. The test score, those who have submitted test scores were actually somewhat higher. But see, that's where the thing. So it's on surface you think, oh, the acceptance rate is a little higher for those who submit test scores, so let me send my test scores in. Not necessarily, because those who are submitting test scores generally have done the research to know that there's a comfort zone that they feel based on our historical ranges in order, for those who did send test scores. So that's really what it's for.
Yep, that's a key lesson. It is not, it is a correlation, not a causation, and we need to think about what else is implied in those numbers. That's great.
You articulated way better than I did. Thank you.
I see you. I talk about this with families a lot. I see you nodding down there, Tyler. Do you want to tell us how this has played out at WPI?
Yeah. So at WPI, we're actually test blind. So that means we do not. Right. Yeah, we don't look at any type of SAT or ACT scores. It's not part of the review process. It's not part of how we award merit scholarships. So you just don't submit them to us, right. And that's just how we do it. We've been test optional. We did a 10-year pilot up until 2018, and we collected a lot of data because faculty wanted to know, how are students doing who submit test optional at WPI? How do they perform at WPI, and what do they do after they graduate? And so through that 10 years, we got a lot of really great data that showed there was no correlation between higher or lower SAT, ACT scores and how they performed at our school, and then their successes after they graduated. So in 2018, we officially went test optional. And then in 2020, for the 2021 enrolling year, we went test blind, and we were headed in that direction. So it wasn't a reaction to the pandemic. It's just the direction we were headed. And we're going to be test blind. So we're not, some universities right now they went test optional during the pandemic, and now they're trying to decide what they're going to be doing as things are improving. But yeah, we're test blind, so students don't have to decide what they want to do. And, families always ask, well, then what do you look at? Well, it's like, there's so much more in the application than
Right.
your 1350 SAT score.
Right, right.
We're looking at your grades, the type of classes you've taken. We're looking at your involvement, what the letters of recommendation they're saying. And to us, that tells us a lot more information than a test score would ever would for our admissions process.
It feels very right for WPI that you did a 10-year study before anybody even knew you were studying it, and then proposed it and then tested it. That just feels very on brand.
Yeah, it's because what happened over those first 10 years, faculty were concerned because, test scores, that's just how the process has been. For my parents, is like your admissions decision hinged on how you did on your SATs. And so faculty wanted to kind of know how that worked. And they actually originally said, instead of a student submitting test scores, if they wanted to go optional, they had to submit a project. But we recognize that as a barrier for a lot of students who might not have access to some sort of project-based learning at the high school level. And that was an argument we made. And then, they finally, after seeing that there's no correlation, agreed that we go completely just test optional, where students could check the box, and then going test blind eventually as well.
Great. I know these are very different questions when a state legislature is involved, Nick. What have you seen at Maryland with the testing in the past couple of years?
Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned it. So you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of sort of the entry level process, is that a lot of what we do is governed by state level policy. And so what the public schools all did in 2020, leading into sort of applicants for the high school class of 2021, was we all went to the chancellor to request a test optional review process, because in spring and summer of 2020, we of course were finding that students legitimately couldn't sit for an SAT, find one, whatever. So students were applying to college without ever having taken an SAT. Much so, at a certain point, it became sort of less a conversation of test optional and just sort of like, has a student even taken an SAT before? And so while we're still finalizing this year's class, what I can say at least about last year's admitted student class, so last year's group of seniors, about 50% of our applicants applied test optional, and about 50% of our admitted students were test optional. And I think that sort of blend was pretty important to us. And I think also goes to show that just, I would like the common question, or one of the common questions, there's no singular common question when it comes to test optional, but one of the questions I often hear is sort of, well, if I don't submit my test score, does that already make me look bad? Like Maryland, we pride ourselves, and we hype sort of our review process that we consider 26 different factors in admission. And so I've had students who come to me who are doing the mental math and realize, like, so if I don't have my test scores, that means you're only reviewing me on 25 out of 26 factors, which means I'm already 4% behind other students because I didn't submit a test score. And then that's just not how it works. I appreciate that you're doing the mental math in front of me.
Right. Cool.
Great. Cool. We've got critical reasoning and math skills. That's good to see. But the reality is just, I think, kind of like Justin said, and I think Tyler touched on it too, like, we have enough information in the application to learn enough about you to make a solid decision and a solid guess of, not just a guess, but really, we have a good idea what kind of student will you be on our campus, with or without test scores. And so when it comes to students who ask that question, should I submit test scores? A response I give is actually like, are you proud of them? Like, are the test scores something that you think you did well on, and something that you think will strengthen your application? And the answer to that question can and likely will change between the different colleges you're applying to. But just because your test score is outside of our sort of the averages or middle 50 percentiles doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad score, and is something that, if you're proud of it and you think it strengthens your application, I say go for it. Like, and it's also like, because we learned so much about you in the application, there's no way to say like, this is a good score, this is a bad score. Like, there's advice and there's recommendations, but when I'm reading your application, I'm looking at a 30 to 50 page PDF document that has lots of words on it, and not very many numbers, because a lot of it is qualitative just as much as the quantitative pieces are important.
Right. I love that concept of strengthening your application. I think one thing that the test optional schools can offer to students is a teeny little bit more control in this process that sometimes feels very out of their control. And I think it's important for a student to sort of think of their own application holistically, not just as a series of achievements that I was supposed to get because someone told me to get them, but holistically, how does this show who I am? And where does this piece fit in? Am I proud of it? Does it strengthen my image of who I am and who I'm showing to this school? I love that. I think Common App said that last year, 73% of students who had test scores submitted them to some schools and not others. So I think that's a pretty common piece to sort of think about, how is my application for this particular environment? Speaking of those 30 pages of-
Can I piggyback on something really quickly?
Yeah.
So I know that we kind of wrapped up that question talking about the holistic process and the review process for our schools with your applications. Here's one thing I caught over the last couple of years, and anybody jump in if it's somewhat similar or different, because you also, Katie, mentioning the Common App. There were students who we didn't even get to review their applications because they were incomplete. And one of the main factors of being incomplete was actually not actually opting in or out of submitting those test scores. So
a lot of head nods.
There were a lot of students, close to late March and April, who were, their friends and peers are getting decisions, and they reach out and they realize that they really didn't kind of check the process for us. And I was, so other schools might have been the same or something, when it comes to what was required for them for us as a committee to actually review your app. And for us, one of the big factors was we did not want to auto assume, even from the Common App, if you opted out of test, we didn't want to assume that you were, for us, opting in or out of your scores. You mentioned, Katie, some so they sent to, some they didn't. So it's very important, just to, once again, and this is part of that stressful thing, we're trying to remember the fun of it, like make sure that you're staying on top of these things, because what we don't want to do is, is not be able to review all those other really cool things about you, if you've opted out of test scores, just because it was a piece they were missing. Where you did.
I will say one of my favorite pieces of college advice that I heard someone give on one of these webinars is maybe create a college only email account and then check it. I think a lot of the pieces of these process get sort of buried in a million emails that I've been getting since I was 13 and I don't read them anymore. So it is a process. You got to check the boxes. You have to keep on top of it. You have to know what you're doing. That's a great.
Me and my family have a Nintendo Switch, and we get all these Nintendo Switch accounts, emails, all these emails. So imagine if you have your own personal email for your system, whatever you have, and then you have a bunch of colleges. That's why it's I would definitely piggyback on that. Create your own account, because then you can kind of separate that from, kind of your personal from the more college admission stuff. Yep.
Then you can pay attention to what you need to be watching. Great. That's a great point. So in that holistic review, all three of your schools historically do a truly holistic review of applications. And that involves a lot of pieces. One of the things I'm getting a ton of questions about these days are letters of recommendation, particularly if I am a junior or I'm a senior, and much of my work in the past year and a half or 2 years has been either online or with masks, or we were in the building, but we weren't always in the building. And so, sort of traditional rule of thumb is 2 junior classes, 2 core classes, maybe a STEM, maybe humanities. But do you have advice for students if say sophomore year was fully online and junior year was maybe weird? What advice on how do I think about who are the teachers to choose for my letters of recommendation? And I'm going to ask Tyler to start because you're unmuted.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And kind of going off of the holistic review, part of the holistic review is that understanding that the way students have received and participated in their education over the last 2 years has been very different than the 2015 to 2020. And so we take that into consideration, knowing that every student went to a school that handled it very differently. And so, when it comes to grades and how a student performed, being virtual for a class and not, we're taking all of that into consideration. So I just wanted to make that point because that's a question we get asked a lot. I just got an email today from a student saying, hey, like we were virtual for a year and I really struggled, but then we got back to the classroom and I was back to straight A's. And it's like, okay, like obviously you're a strong student, just virtual is just not your thing. So I just want to make that point. And in regards to the letters of recommendation, yeah, it definitely can be tricky, but just kind of thinking about, what class do you think your teacher could provide information to us as counselors about who you are, either as an academic student or as a person? Can they talk about your character and how you work with your peers? Can they talk about how you do on assignments or working in teams? Kind of thinking it strategically that way. It doesn't always have to be a letter of rec from the teacher that teaches the class and the program you want to study in college. So that's something I just want to make sure students are aware of, because we often get that at WPI being STEM.
Right.
Are like, oh, like I have a really good connection with my English teacher. Is it okay if they write a letter of recommendation? Absolutely. Like if they can provide us insight for who you are as a person, I'd much rather have that teacher write the letter than just someone just because they teach a class that you might be taking at our school.
Right.
So thinking of it that way would be beneficial, but also taking advantage of teachers for letters of recommendation that might be a club advisor for you and that knows you outside the context of academics could also be really beneficial because when you come to a college, you're not only taking classes, you're becoming an active participant in our campus communities. We want to make sure that that would be a good fit for you as well. And so, don't, think about that aspect as well.
Great. I also really love that 2 parts of your story were about students reaching out to you. Just want to emphasize and highlight that all of these men and everyone I have ever talked to in an admissions office wants to hear from you. They want questions from students. They want to know what you're wondering about. They want to actually tell you the truth to make this easier and more fun for you. That's their job and they like it.
Yeah, a lot of the time. So one, definitely email us. It's our job to handle these types of questions. But the second thing is, a lot of times, we're talking about, the stresses and the myths and that sort of stuff. A lot of times these emails that we get, students are saying, oh, I've heard. And it's like, well, no, that's not actually what it is. So let me clear that up. And then where the source, because I'm going to be the one actually reading your application. So, if people are telling you things, that's great. But if you want to get, the truth, send it to the school that you're interested in and we'll clear it right up. And it's usually not as bad as what people are saying. So that's usually how it works.
Nick, how about you? What's your advice on letters of recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, it's like Katie, the concept that you described of just students and not having sort of connections to their teachers over the last 2 years, I think is definitely valid and is understandable. And I'm really glad Tyler mentioned the holistic side of things and the emphasis that we are indeed humans and we are indeed the ones who read out your applications. Trust me, it is cheaper to have a computer make admission decisions, but there's a reason that humans do it. And it's because of the context and the understanding and the human element that we bring, and that is important to learning about who you are as individuals and who you would be on our campuses. In terms of the letters of rec, I mean, our general advice has always been we require one from a school counselor and one from a teacher, and the teacher should generally come from a core subject. So math, English, science, social studies, and foreign language. It doesn't necessarily have to be junior year. I think historically students have often gravitated to senior year because high school is a time of change, and your freshman English teacher will probably write something a little bit different than your junior English teacher would in terms of how you perform in the classroom or sort of your personality, your interests. All that being said, your junior English teacher might not know you that well this year just because of present circumstances. And so I think the biggest piece of advice I would give in terms of trying to find somebody who can offer a letter of recommendation is find somebody who you really connected with as a teacher. Find somebody who knows you well enough to write a quality letter of recommendation, who can tell us as, you know, admission readers what kind of student you are and what kind of person you might be at our colleges.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Justin, anything to add to that?
If you as students are having some trouble because of lack of access and stuff of finding people, finding teachers, counselors and such, maybe it's limited, but you're kind of growing the relationship as a student in their classes as well. I would feel free to have some type of either activity sheet or bulleted point statement that you can provide to them as part of developing the relationship in the conversation. And you think for a future letter of recommendation, you know, tell them what you enjoy so far, maybe about the class. Tell them what you what activities you're a part of that they might not know. You know, maybe they only know you in the class, or maybe one other club or something that got out of that. Provide some more information for them, because I think that will help the conversation as you also are there academically, but also they get to know you as a person too. And that can also, of course, impact the letter recommendation that they hopefully will give you in the future.
That is such smart advice, Justin. And I think it makes teachers' jobs a little easier, which is something we all want to do. And again, it kind of gives students a way to see a pathway for themselves, having a little bit of agency in this process. I love that. That's great advice. I want to ask you, I'm going to go quickly to our Q&A, so I just realized it's suddenly 7:50 and I don't know how that happened. I just was talking and suddenly we're done. But to follow up on this, one of our viewers says, as a college prep school counselor, it is tough to advise students as to the number of letters of rec. Some colleges need none, don't want them. Some want just one from a core academic course, some two, some specific subjects. Nick did just list what he would consider a core subject, and I noticed, and this counselor noticed, because we both get this question a lot, that you included language. I'm sure all the language teachers out there feel very respected, because that is not always something that students suggest. And then this question, though, I do think is, I get this a lot, back to the point you made earlier, Tyler, about students coming to WPI. When I've seen a huge increase in high school curricula of things like computer science and engineering and sort of pre-professional pathways that are sort of core-y, but not core-y. How should a student sort of evaluate that teacher as a prospect for a letter of recommendation?
I mean, for WPI, that would be a great letter of recommendation. If you're taking a class with a teacher, and it's a semester-long course or even a year-long, but the high school considers it an elective, you know, like an engineering class, you know, we'd still absolutely consider it, you know, if it was like an accounting, you know, it's still a teacher who you worked with on assignments and on group projects, and they can talk about that. So, but that's a great question to email a counselor. If you're interested in a school as a student and they say they require 2 core teacher letters of rec, and you're not really sure by the parameters they've given, email the school and they will tell you, and you'd be like, hey, I want my computer science teacher to write a letter, and they'll reply, and that would get you your answer.
Excellent, great point. And that may also vary by school.
Yeah.
And so it's important to kind of understand what you're looking at. Before I get to kind of closing off, I think we had one other question in here from my boss, actually. Hi, Ned. We were talking earlier about all of these questions of size. And I often find that students, as I said, start with assumptions about size. And I think the advice to kind of go visit is and I think Justin was the one who said, like, get the sense of the vibe, like, see what it feels like. Ned wondered if you have any advice for students when their parents declare on their behalf that a school is too big or too small for them. Nick, let's start with a big one. Do you have any suggestions if a parent says, forget it, you can't look at Maryland, I don't care if the Big Ten is cool?
Well, I can tell you a lot of people in Maryland don't really aren't fans of the Big Ten anyway, so that may be a fair reason. No, I think I hear this a lot, and I understand it and recognize and appreciate that different students thrive better in certain academic settings. 100%, no disagreement. The piece that I would try to counter offer is to say, you know, at least take a tour, right? Like it's it's one of those things where you don't really know it until until you've actually seen it and until you've really experienced it. And the same is true for me. Like I mentioned that I came to Maryland because it was a big state school with a business school. Early on, I thought I really wanted to go to my dad's alma mater, which is Wake Forest. And so we did a tour, and it's a very different vibe. And for a lot of different reasons. Wake Forest is a relatively small private school. Maryland is obviously a large state school. But I think, I thought sort of that smaller environment would be better. And just touring it, you sort of get this different perspective. And sort of kind of touch on one of Justin's points earlier, you just get sort of a vibe and an impression of an environment. And different schools can do different things. Just because there are 30,000 students doesn't mean that your classes will be 1,000 students each. Right. There are going to be different ways to make that university experience exactly what you want it to be. Right. And what I liked about Maryland was, yes, I did have lectures that were, 200 students, and I could sit in the second to last row and not be called on by my professor, or I could sit in the first 3 rows and engage with a professor, depending on what class it was. And I think you get that kind of flexibility in some cases, or you can go try and find exclusively smaller classes, even on a larger campus. So larger schools will give you more options for sure, but there's also certainly those benefits to smaller and medium-sized schools too.
I would say that sometimes even that visit, even if I'm close to a school that is large or small, and that particular school may not be the one that I'm considering, getting on that campus, figuring out what that feels like, that also gives me a sense of the questions I want to ask about these other schools I'm looking at. Like you can do some visits just to really get a sense of the sort of general vibe, and then start figuring out the specific ones. All right, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I want to give you each a chance to end on something awesome. So tell me something wonderful you're excited about on your campus right now, or something great about coming back to campus, something you saw this year, or something you're excited for next year. Justin, you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. As I was mentioned to you all before we had started, I've been out of the office a little bit, and even when I'm traveling, I don't get a chance. We as admissions folks, it's tough. We sometimes can feel like a little siloed. We're so connected to the institution, but because we're out recruiting or meeting prospective students and families, counselors, advisors, it's tough sometimes to really kind of stay in tune with the daily happenings of what's going on in your institution. And I always remain fascinated, just speaking for Binghamton, of something that's just happening every single day there. There's always something happening. And I'm always like, I would really like to go to that. Literally in the last like 3 weeks, there was a recognition ceremony in gardening of the main 3. They call them the sisters. It's the corn, I think, the corn, squash, and I'm missing the other one. And it was from our one of our local nations, Onondaga Nation. And it was a recognition of the land recognition ceremony on Binghamton's campus, and then the planting of these 3 sister, they call them the 3 sisters, in our science building, right outside our science building, kind of building that relationship between our indigenous tribes in our area, in our Broome County area, and outside of it, and the university and the institution, and recognizing that. That was one day. And then literally like another day, there was a lecture. There was a special guest lecture from Margaret Atwood, the author of The Handmaid's Tale, who was on campus, and was given a special guest lecture. And then after that, there was through our Harriet Tubman Center, which is a research center. The founder and the head of that center right now worked as part of the 1619 project. They were giving a discussion on reparations. And I use those 3 as an examples because there is so much happening on just like a daily, weekly basis on the campus for students, faculty, staff, that it just really constantly gets me excited of all that's available for students in this kind of, like I said, academic, kind of social, cultural environment of the institution. So I think that's just a really cool factor that always amazes me.
All of that was awesome, Justin. Wow. And I mentioned earlier before we started that I've actually not ever had a chance to visit your campus, and now I want to more than ever. So I'm going to try and make that happen this summer.
Please do.
Tyler, tell us about what you're excited about at WPI.
Yeah, so I would say two things. One with, returning back to things pre-pandemic, a big facet of WPI's education is the opportunity to study abroad. It's a big reason why students choose WPI. Being a STEM institution, some programs, it can be very difficult at some universities to study abroad and be an engineer or a science student and still graduate in that traditional 4 years. But at WPI, we structure it uniquely where you can go abroad. It's a graduation requirement, and over 80% of students choose to do that. And over the last couple of years, a lot of students haven't been able to do that. We've had to shift and do a lot more local projects that students would traditionally do abroad, but we're slowly starting to reopen our project centers globally. And that's something really exciting because it's, like I said, a big reason why a lot of students choose to come to WPI is to be able to spend a term abroad in Windhoek, Namibia, and Southern Africa. And so for them to have that opportunity again, I'm really excited for that.
That's exciting.
And then the second thing is we're in between presidents right now at the university, which is an exciting time. So they're in the process of hiring a new president. Dr. Leshin just left right after graduation this past Saturday to go run the Jet Propulsion Research Center in Southern California for NASA. I think that's what it's called. She came to us from NASA. So
That's what it's called.
To it. Yeah. So we're really excited to see who that individual will be and what they're going to bring to the university and what stamp they're going to put. Because Dr. Leshin, she's the first female president at WPI, which is a really big deal for a STEM school. And she definitely left her mark in regards to work with recruiting and enrolling and the success of women at WPI. So we're excited to see what that next chapter is going to be.
That is exciting.
Yeah.
All right, Nick, finish us off here. What exciting things are happening in College Park?
I mean, so on the one hand, it's commencement tomorrow. So we graduate a little bit later because we start our semesters a little bit later. So tomorrow is an exciting time, and I will just tell you, I'm not looking forward to traffic on and around campus tomorrow. But also just like fun and lighthearted. We're the lacrosse capital of the world once again. Ladies, women's lacrosse is into the Final Four as of this afternoon. Men's lacrosse has a quarterfinal game on Saturday. And also men's baseball, where we are historically not a powerhouse, is on pace to be a top 16 team in the country and host a regional. So fun times on campus. Come hang out this summer.
That is fun times on campus. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Please reach out to us at edplanning@prepmatters.com if you have any questions. Our next town hall takes place on Thursday, June 16th at 7 p.m. It's a particularly special one because we have a great group of current seniors reflecting on their process and their year and giving advice to the rising seniors. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy and enjoying some sunshine. And please check us out on Twitter at Prep Matters. And I am Moxa Doodle, and I wish you all a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Take care.
Bye.